Welcome to the Council on Strategic Risk Podcast Network, where we discuss anticipating, analyzing, and addressing core systemic risks to security in the 21st century. I am your host, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. The focus of today's episode is the United Arab Emirates, following our last two podcasts on Pakistan and China. Please do check them out if you haven't already. Today's guests are Joyce Connery and Seth Grae. Joyce Connery is a board member and former chairman of the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. The Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board is an independent organization within the executive branch, chartered with the responsibility of providing recommendations and advice to the President and the Secretary of Energy regarding public health and safety issues at the Department of Energy's Defense Nuclear Facilities. Prior to her confirmation as the chairman of DNFSB, Ms. Connery was the Director of Nuclear Energy Policy within the Office of International Economics on the National Security Council. In that position, Ms. Connery worked to develop policy among agencies and align and coordinate programs covering nuclear safety, security, and nuclear trade. Seth Grae is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Lightbridge. During his tenure, Lightbridge has evolved into a leader in developing advanced nuclear fuel technologies and in providing advisory services to developing and existing nuclear energy programs, seeking to meet the highest international standards of safety, non-proliferation, and transparency. Lightbridge also advises governments of countries seeking to start nuclear power programs, from feasibility studies through procurement and operations. Lightbridge's first major international engagement was to develop the strategic plan, the roadmap for success, for commercial nuclear energy for the United Arab Emirates. Lightbridge is engaged by domestic and overseas governmental entities on critically important civil nuclear advisory matters. Welcome, Joyce. Thank you for being here today, Seth. So you've both played very important roles related to the UAE's nuclear energy program. Let's start with you, Joyce. Can you give us kind of a macro view about it? Tell us about it a bit.
Thanks for having me. I'd just like to remind you that I'm here in my own capacity, and therefore the views that I represent today are my own views and not those of the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board or the U.S. government. So I would say that my role was more broad than the United Arab Emirates energy program. When I was in the Bush administration at the tail end, when the United Arab Emirates had stated that they were looking to start a civilian nuclear program for peaceful uses. And they were seeking to get what's called a Section 123 agreement, which is an agreement between the government of the United States and the government, in this case, of the United Arab Emirates, allowing us to engage in nuclear trade. So that was my role during the Bush administration. That agreement actually came into force under the Obama administration, and it was one of several international cooperation agreements with which I was working during my tenure, both in the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Later on, in the Obama administration, I was working for the Department of Energy, for the Deputy Secretary of Energy, and was reacquainted with the United Arab Emirates and their energy programs writ large, and spent some time with the UAE talking to them about their plans for both nuclear energy as well as trying to wean themselves off of their dependency on fossil fuels. When I returned to the National Security Council in the White House as the Director of Energy Policy, the program at the United Arab Emirates was well on its way, and that's actually when I met Seth in his role at Lightbridge, and because I was helping to facilitate conversations amongst the nuclear energy industry officials as well as the U.S. government officials to see if we could more effectively enhance our nuclear trade cooperation with the world.
Thank you for that overview. Seth, what do you think? Can you talk to us a little bit about what are the trends you've been noticing? So will the country eventually not be able to rely on oil exports anymore to support the economy? What is happening with education as well for men and women?
Well, I think that's an excellent question and really goes partly to the heart of why the UAE decided to develop a nuclear power program. In 2008, we helped the UAE develop feasibility studies to provide the energy that the country would need over the coming decades. And it is out of that the nuclear power program emerged. partly because there was a notion that while more oil may well be found in the world, they pretty much know where it is in Abu Dhabi, and they don't expect a whole lot more to be found within the UAE. Some other places within the UAE, such as Dubai, are already virtually out of oil, and Abu Dhabi is really the only oil-producing emirate of the 7 within the United Arab Emirates. And within 30 to 50 years, it's possible that the UAE will not be exporting oil. And the difference between 30 and 50 years is really the world market price of oil. As the oil is becoming more expensive to extract from deeper underground and to refine the oil from that deep depths, depending on the world price of oil, they might not be able to extract it at a profit. So the country needs to wean itself off burning oil at home to provide energy, sell the oil, and use the revenue to diversify the economy. So the country's been doing an excellent job of that, actually, and has been moving very quickly to train its people, diversify the economy. The part of your question relating to education is very important because the Emiratization program overall in the UAE is seeking to educate and train people for the jobs of the present and the future. And the nuclear program has helped add engineering disciplines and other disciplines to universities in the UAE, and they've been sending large numbers of students outside the UAE to be trained as well. And they've been inviting universities from the outside the country to come and set up campuses within the UAE. And New York University is one of the campuses that has accepted and now has many students from the US, from the UAE, and around the world studying at their campus in Abu Dhabi.
So I'd like to add, I think this goes to the core of why UAE chose to go down the road on nuclear, is that they were both interested in diversifying their energy platform and their electricity generation, but they were also interested in innovation, which is kind of a cornerstone of their progress moving forward. So their projections out with regards to not just energy production, but also what they would need to diversify from oil and gas revenue has to do with innovation. So they are not just looking at nuclear energy, they're also looking at renewables and technological advances in those areas as well, not just for domestic consumption, but also to be a world leader. As the leadership of the UAE has told the U.S. government on many occasions, it's not about being oil producers, it's about being energy producers. And what that energy mix looks like because of the issues of climate change, because of the issues of the depleted natural resource that will be oil. And as Seth outlined, the prices that will go up over time, it was a strategic decision on their part to move smartly in this direction. They're also trying to obviously conserve energy as well, because that will help with both the economic issues as well as the carbon emissions issues.
The UAE expects the reactors will provide about a quarter of the country's electricity needs. The other 3/4 will come from other sources, including renewables. And within the transportation sector and manufacturing and agriculture, the UAE is also looking to decrease the percentage of fossil fuels and is innovating in those areas and supporting innovation.
This seems like a big shift away from previous generations and attitude and perception, but it seems also to be really supported by the public and the government. Would you say that's an accurate characterization of the UAE at the moment?
Well, what I'd say is that the polling among Emiratis shows very strong and sustained support for the nuclear power program. And I think one reason for that is that the government and the companies carrying out the program have done an excellent job of engaging the Emirati people. And there have been many town hall type meetings, and literally everyone in the country who has a question about the program has the opportunity to meet senior people involved with the program, ask questions, and then do so again. So it's been a constant engagement with the population, very transparent for a nuclear power program, and I think that that's worked well on public acceptance.
I also think the UAE has a tendency, even prior to the nuclear program, to take the long view, and this is certainly a long view. When you look at nuclear, it's a 100-year commitment, and that's something that the Emiratis feel confident they can take, whereas other governments may not feel that they can take that type of a commitment because of shifting viewpoints, either of the population or of the political leadership.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that with our listeners. So the Council on Strategic Risks Working Group that we're all a part of on climate, nuclear, and security affairs has drawn attention to the concern that countries other than the United States appear to be leading in supplying nuclear energy systems globally. So can you both talk to us a little bit about what you see happening in the global nuclear suppliers market? And what do you think this means for nuclear security, safety, and non-proliferation? Why don't we start with you, Seth?
Well, the largest supplier now of new reactors around the world is state-owned companies owned by the government of Russia. The second largest is state-owned companies owned by the government of China. And then following that, we have state-owned companies owned by the governments of South Korea and France. And then distantly trailing behind that is the United States with private companies. And to compete against these state-owned companies with the resources of the state behind them, the United States is taking some steps. We've made some changes recently to the Export-Import Bank of the United States, which allows it to, again, finance large projects, including in nuclear power. There's some legislation going through Congress now supporting funding of innovation. But mostly, the United States is moving toward more advanced technologies, be they more advanced fuels to export for the existing reactors, small modular reactors that the United States has excellent technology and more advanced reactors following those to compete with the very large, what are called light water reactors against Russia and China. It is possible, but without the state support that those countries bring, I just don't think ours companies will have as many orders in those areas.
How about you, Joyce?
So I'm going to open up the aperture a bit and just give some facts to your listeners. Right now, there are 444 operable nuclear power reactors globally. There's 54 under construction, 111 planned, and 330 proposed. So Seth's breakdown is absolutely right about who is building and constructing those reactors across the world and the fact that they're mostly being constructed by state-owned companies. In the United States, we have 98 operating reactors in 30 states. But those reactors are facing pressures from cheap natural gas, and the utilities are having a hard time keeping them open. So to go back to the United Arab Emirates for the moment, it's not coincidental that there's a World Energy Congress taking place in Abu Dhabi currently. The United States has 98 operating reactors in 30 states and is facing challenges with cheap natural gas in keeping those reactors operating. And Seth talks about the fact that the United States is trying to challenge these other countries in terms of exports by putting more time and effort into innovation and advanced reactors and what we're calling small modular reactors, which would be able to fit more grids globally. I believe it's a three-pronged process that we have to go through. In the United States, we have to be able to maintain those reactors that we have, the 99 operating reactors, in order to reach our climate goals. Right now, that's 19% of electricity generation in the United States is nuclear, but that's about 60% of our non-carbon generation. So if we keep shutting those reactors down, we may not be able to catch up on the renewable side, regardless of how much we innovate. Specifically, if we're going to do something like electrify our car fleet or our bus fleet, you're going to have substantial electricity generation, and that's why it's important to be able to maintain these reactors in the near term.
And if we want them to be reliable, correct? If we want reliable energy,
yes,
it has to play a role.
Nuclear will have to play a role in the near term. In the midterm, again, small modular reactors, both domestically and globally, we see as very promising because they can fit into smaller grid profiles and have, in theory, a lower operating cost and a lower startup cost. The big problem to both countries and domestically to building new nuclear is it's very capital intensive. And it's not something that can be done again, as I said before, it's a 100-year commitment. So you have to be able to forecast that you're going to be able to afford this over a long period of time. And then the third prong of the stool, I would say, or the third foot of the stool would be the advanced reactor technology. And that's going to be trying to do what the U.S. has always done, which is to compete through innovation rather than simple mass marketing. But that being said, the challenges, and this is one of the reasons why my role was created at the National Security Council, one of the challenges, how do you compete? How do our industries stay competitive in a world in which the other countries have the full backing of their governments to include financing? The role of the Ex-Im Bank is going to be important, but again, compared to the financing and the backing that the government of Russia and the government of China can potentially provide to new nuclear entrants, we're facing an uphill battle.
So the United Arab Emirates launched its nuclear energy program long before the Paris Climate Agreement. And the issues of climate change and nuclear energy are increasingly linked in many ways. One is the direct effects of climate change near nuclear sites. So Joyce, you just gave a really interesting background. Can you expand a little bit and talk about governance and regulation at the macro level? And then we can get into specifics with the UAE.
So there's a kind of a two-way street when it comes to climate. Because of climate change, there is a push toward nuclear as a carbon-free, baseload, reliable source of electricity. On the other hand, the concerns that you all are raising are concerns with regards to, can those reactors withstand extreme shifts in climate that could cause weather events near to reactors that are being built. And obviously Fukushima is one of the case examples that a number of people give with regards to potential vulnerabilities of nuclear reactors in the face of extreme weather events. So I would just say in general, that is a concern. It is a risk that has to be mitigated. I don't think it is an insurmountable risk. In the United States, for instance, we undergo what we call a hazard analysis with regards to our nuclear power plants, and those get updated periodically. So the power reactor operators, with the direction of it in some instances, or at least the attention of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will analyze the potential hazards of their particular reactor in their surrounds and determine whether or not upgrades are necessary based on an understanding of the climate impacts that are in that vicinity. So
it's taken into analysis.
It's taken into analysis. Now, in some cases, whether it has a direct impact on public health and safety, then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can require that upgrades are done. If the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doesn't deem that it's a direct impact to public health and safety, then that's a risk analysis that the reactor itself, the utility itself, will undertake to determine whether or not it will take mitigating steps. And they'll probably do some kind of a cost-benefit analysis to see if the increases in safety or protection of their own property, in this case, outweighs the cost of doing whatever physical upgrades that would need to be done to mitigate the hazard that you're trying to address.
Right. So that's the United States, and it varies across countries. So how about in the UAE? So model projections show that sea level rise and extreme heat waves may hit the UAE hard in the decades ahead, at which time its nuclear reactors should still be operating. So Seth, do you see those who work on and oversee nuclear infrastructure addressing these things? And what else can be done to ensure preparedness over the long term?
Well, first let me say the UAE has a very high carbon footprint per capita and is taking steps to improve the situation. When the 4 reactors at the Baraka site in the UAE open, it will reduce the UAE's carbon footprint per capita, I believe, by more than any other country in the world has reduced its carbon footprint per capita. And then the UAE is taking additional steps to improve it more. Now, the UAE decided not to build these reactors on an ocean coast. They're not on the Indian Ocean coast of the UAE. They're at the Baraka site alongside the Persian Gulf. And they did do very long-term planning and studies of what could happen over the very long term to make sure the site will be protected from climactic events, including sea rise. They did elevate the site quite a bit before starting reactor construction. The nuclear power plants were designed to be able to handle the largest change in temperature of any reactor in the world. The reactors also, if need be, could be derated if there were an event. Rather than producing 1,400 megawatts of electricity from each reactor, they could reduce power. And the UAE does have a very strong safety culture. And in addition to their own safety culture at the utility, as Joyce was talking about, the independent regulator also would make sure that those reactors are run very safely. And finally, I'll say the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, the entity that is deploying these reactors, is a very active member of WANO, the World Association of Nuclear Operators, and participates globally relating to best practices. They're often actually cited their own program as a best practice in the world. And literally every nuclear utility in the world participates and gets to comment on the UAE program, and they're taking advice and complying with input from all over the world, including to making sure those reactors will always be very safe in any climactic event.
Thank you for explaining that and also spelling out what WANO, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Stands for. We in DC love our acronyms, don't we? So we appreciate when we know what the full title is. So you're talking, both of you have now brought up security and safety. And we know that security around nuclear sites and materials is critically important. So what do you think, expand a little bit more. So there's this global governance that I think you explained very clearly, Seth, and a standard for anyone participating in nuclear energy. But what do you think about the state of nuclear security around the world today? And from a U.S. perspective, do you have ideas on ways we can do more in this area?
So with regards to security, I think that there's often a conflating of issues with regards to nuclear security. In the Obama administration, for instance, we were very focused on nuclear security, but we were hyper-focused on the materials that could be used directly to make a nuclear weapon, so plutonium and highly enriched uranium. So the centering concept of the nuclear security summits, the 4 summits that took place under the Obama administration, was to protect nuclear materials around the world that could be used directly, in the first instance, in a nuclear weapon or in a radiological dispersal device, which was targeted at specific nuclear sources and not necessarily spent nuclear fuel from a power plant or nuclear power reactors. On the power reactor side, the material that is used is not directly reusable within a nuclear weapon. And it would take a state program or a significant non-state actor program in order to get that material into a configuration that it could be used in a nuclear weapon. And I believe that folks sometimes conflate those two things. Particularly the press has this habit of talking about a country going nuclear, and that could mean one of two things: that they're seeking a nuclear weapon or they're seeking a nuclear power program. And often the reason we preface the peaceful nuclear program is because we want people to understand that a country that is seeking nuclear power in order to combat climate change, in order to desalinate water, in order to provide electricity to their people, are not necessarily seeking those things with an ulterior motive to create a nuclear weapon and to get into an arms race in their region. So once we've established that, the security issues around nuclear are similar to those, I would say, around power grids and other vulnerable infrastructures within countries that would be vulnerable to sabotage. And I think that's, when we talk about security, one of the things that we look at. Of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States has purview over the security of our nuclear power plants and has regulations with regards to how one protects both the nuclear power plants and the used nuclear fuel that resides on the power plant. And internationally, again, there are also standards. The International Atomic Energy Agency, for instance, has guidelines for countries that have nuclear power programs in order to make sure that they're operated safely and securely.
Seth, would you like to expand on security and safety of nuclear energy participation around the world?
The UAE decided to start a nuclear power program not as a model for the world, but for its own needs. But they've handled it very responsibly in a way that actually is serving as a model and is invoked around the world as a very responsible way to handle nuclear power programs. There are only two parts of what's called the nuclear fuel cycle that can lead to nuclear explosive devices. One is what's called enriching uranium so that it can be used in fuel for reactors. And the second is what's called reprocessing after the fuel has already been used in a reactor, chemically extracting plutonium that potentially could be used in a weapon. The UAE, at the very beginning, came up with its own policy, the binding national policy of the country, that it would never enrich uranium in the UAE, and it would never reprocess the used fuel in the UAE. The UAE then passed a law nationally with the same commitment. And when asked by the State Department, the UAE agreed to put that as a binding commitment into what's called its 123 agreement for civil nuclear cooperation with the United States. And this is really unique in that the country decided to do this on its own, took these steps, and it did it reflecting the program that it wanted to provide energy and do so very safely and not raise security issues. I don't think the UAE intended that to be a model for other countries, but it's certainly something the U.S. Congress notices whether other countries are willing to make those types of commitments. I also think that this podcast series and the Council on Strategic Risk focus on core systemic risks. And having a podcast on the UAE nuclear program infers that there are core systemic risks just from the fact that they're doing that. But I think that this commitment to not enriching, not reprocessing, to participating in the World Association of Nuclear Operators, to have key people, including from the United States, in some of the senior positions throughout the nuclear program inside the country, would really help to show that this program is not a core systemic risk. And it will be supplied with nuclear fuel that will be enriched outside the country, so they will never be able to make a weapon, and they will never reprocess fuel in the country. So I think in many ways this really is a story of success on providing non-carbon energy, of making sure that strategic risks that could threaten the UAE or others are avoided, and to help advance the economy of the country and train their people.
Seth, I think you're making a really strong case for the UAE and its nuclear energy program. That being said, the UAE is near a spate of oil tanker attacks that we've seen in the area's waterways in 2019. This is another reminder of the region's complex security challenges, and this could evolve in ways we don't necessarily understand right now in the coming decades. So if you take the additional circumstances into account, then what are the security risks for the region now and over the next 10 to 20 years? Do we still have the same optimism that you so eloquently just conveyed? Should we still have that?
I think that security risks have come from where those oil tankers are going to, depending on countries in the Middle East sending them oil. And it's telling that some of them, led by the UAE, are themselves trying to wean off fossil fuel dependency. I think the fact that there have been attacks on oil tankers in the Middle East, first of all, are the kinds of attacks that could happen anywhere in the world. And there have been threats, for example, near Gibraltar in the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that these nuclear reactors aren't going anywhere. They're not going out on oil tankers. They're on a very well protected site. They are protected under many, many feet of concrete and steel and highly protected and can be turned off at any time. They can't sink if attacked. And it is a dangerous neighborhood, but in many ways we're starting to also see a lot of security cooperation. There's clearly security cooperation between Egypt and Israel, between Israel and other Gulf states. We're seeing the UAE recently toning down rhetoric relating to Iran and clearly not looking to be involved in any war in the region, although clearly willing to protect their interests. And in some ways, having something worth protecting or not wanting to lose helps countries get that way too. I think Iran has its own Russian deployed nuclear reactors. And I don't think it's in either country's interest to see these sites become targets. And I think that partly could help breed responsible behavior, at least I hope so. But the UAE also, I think, should not shy away from what it decided was a necessary part of its carbon-free and safe energy generation system for the future. And if other countries in the world can pursue nuclear power, the UAE doesn't see why it can't either, especially if it does to the highest of international standards.
So what is the U.S. view on this? Are we equipped to address the U.S. current and future interests regarding the UAE? Are there things we should be doing differently? What do you say, Joyce?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question with regards to U.S. interests in the UAE, because obviously the UAE's power program is its own domestic concern. We obviously have a relationship with them with regards to having a 123 agreement, and through some of those agreements, we help supply some of the equipment for the Baraka power plants. And as Seth noted, we have some U.S. citizens who've been helping establish the program and making sure that it's a safe and secure program as it moves forward. But I would say, with regards to your earlier question, a lot of conflict in the world has come about because of competition over finite resources of oil and gas. And when you look at nuclear energy, the more broadly it's able to be applied in a safe and secure manner, the less those tensions around oil and gas and who is supplying whom and who's receiving income for those will actually, I believe, be a stress reliever in terms of competition for energy resources. And not to be Pollyanna about the whole thing. The UAE did it right. There are other countries that may not pursue the activity in such a transparent way. And whenever you have somebody going through a program such as a nuclear power program in a way that's not transparent, or in which there aren't guarantees that they won't be diverting material for nefarious purposes, for an enrichment program or for a reprocessing program that will lead them to have fissile material that could then be used for a nuclear weapon, that's when tensions start to rise. That's what you see in Iran. The UAE didn't want to be perceived that way, so they proceeded in a very transparent way to address what was a domestic challenge with regards to their energy needs, but also a vision about where they wanted to be in the world in the future as an energy supplier. And they don't want to be a pariah state, hence the transparency with which they pursued their program. If other countries follow that model, I think we'll have fewer concerns going forward.
Thank you for sharing that. This has been really insightful for me. I'm sure listeners will agree with that. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners?
I'm glad that the Council on Strategic Risks is having this podcast series. I think that in some ways the UAE is a little bit of an outlier in that we're arguing that the way they're handling their program is not in any way threatening any strong core systemic risks or strategic risks. Now, it could have gone the other way. The UAE has made decisions working with advisors from other countries, working with people inside their country to guide their nuclear power program in a way that it is being run very responsibly. And one point that I think is important for the future of the program to give us some confidence that it will continue to be run so responsibly is the public engagement and the passing of domestic policies and domestic laws and promising their own people that this is how they're running the program, that they'll never enrich uranium, they'll never reprocess plutonium. If the government or the companies involved ever switched positions, I think the people would have a lot of questions. And I think the government and the companies, the people running the companies are very serious, and they mean this for the long term, and they are very responsible people. And I'm sure that this is the future of the program that will be run as responsibly as it is today. But I'm grateful for the transparency and commitment to their own people and the buy-in from their own people as something that does show the sustainability of these promises that are made.
Joyce, final parting thoughts?
So on a global level, I think you guys are asking the right questions. You're looking at this from a strategic risk perspective, and you're weighing the risk of catastrophic climate change with the development of nuclear programs in parts of the world where you may not be as familiar or as comfortable with their processes for pursuing such programs. And I think that whenever you look at how you're going to engage with countries that are pursuing these programs, or if you're a country yourself trying to develop them, you have to be able to evaluate those risks and do what's not only what's best for your citizens, but also as a global responsible citizen, in this case, with regards to climate change. There is an international norm when it comes to developing nuclear power programs. The International Atomic Energy Agency obviously plays a key role in that by both providing assistance to countries that are seeking nuclear power, and not only nuclear power, but nuclear medicine and all of the other positive attributes of the atom. And they also provide the role of watchdog, which is to determine whether or not a country is seeking to divert those materials for nefarious purposes. But mostly that's also to provide transparency to the rest of the world, to give them confidence in those programs. So as long as we buy into that shared responsibility and recognize too that the nuclear power industry is, at the end of the day, an industry, it's a business. So there isn't a lot of countries or companies that have any interest in their materials being diverted for nefarious purposes, because it's bad for business. So they have an enlightened self-interest in that respect, to make sure that when they build nuclear power plants, they're building them safely, they're taking the hazards into consideration, and that they're taking the risks of both sabotage and whatever else could happen to the reactor into consideration with every step of the program.
That was very well put. Both of you have provided really unique perspectives that are much appreciated by the Council on Strategic Risks and our listeners. And thank you very much for your time and contribution.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.